Hey guys, tonight, the altar of aesthetics. The year is 1384. The setting, a cold stone-walled chamber in the heart of Burgundy. Outside, the winter wind howls through the battlement, but inside, there is only the rhythmic, agonizing sound of a silver tweezer hitting a porcelain bowl. For the Lady Isabeau, beauty was not a gift, it was a mandate. To be born noble was to be born as a vessel for family ambition. In the Middle Ages, the female face was a canvas not for personal expression, but for the reflection of divine favor. A beautiful bride was seen as a soul made visible. If she was radiant, she was virtuous. If she was plain, she was suspected of a clouded spirit. This was the altar of aesthetics, a silent, demanding god that required sacrifices of blood, skin, and breath. The theology of the face. To understand the pressure on a medieval noblewoman, one must understand the church's gaze. The clergy taught that Eve's sin had tarnished all women. Therefore, a bride must strive to look like the Virgin Mary, the Stella Maris. This meant her skin had to be as white as the lilies of purity, and her cheeks as red as the roses of martyrdom. But nature is rarely so poetic. Isabeau sat before a polished steel mirror, her reflection flickering in the candlelight. Her lady-in-waiting Catherine worked with practiced brutal precision. Today was the first of the preparation weeks leading to Isabeau's marriage to a duke she had only met once. The duke was 40. Isabeau was 14. To bridge that gap of age and power, she had only one weapon, her appearance. "Steady, my lady," Catherine whispered. "The higher the brow, the closer to the heavens." The ritual of the receding line. In the 14th century, a high, domed forehead was the ultimate symbol of intelligence and aristocratic breeding. A low hairline was considered peasant-like and animalistic. To achieve this divine look, Isabeau did not simply style her hair, she destroyed it. Catherine applied a caustic paste made of quicklime and orpiment, a yellow arsenic sulfide. The mixture hissed slightly as it touched the delicate skin of Isabeau's hairline. The pain was immediate, a chemical sear that felt like a line of fire being drawn across her skull. Isabeau clenched her silk skirts until her knuckles turned white. But she did not cry out. To cry was to be weak, and a future duchess must be iron. After the paste had bent the hair, the manual labor began. One by one, Catherine plucked the remaining hairs from the roots, pushing Isabeau's hairline nearly 2 inches. The result was a haunting ethereal oval, the egg-shaped face so prized by poets. But the price was a scalp covered in weeping red sores, hidden later by a heavy velvet headdress. The ghostly mask. Once the forehead was sculpted, the focus shifted to the complexion. In the American imagination, we often view the Middle Ages as a time of dirt and grime, for the peasantry perhaps, but for the bride, cleanliness was a ritual of erasure. The medieval world was obsessed with the pale. A tan face was the mark of a woman who labored in the fields. A white face was the mark of a woman who lived behind stone walls, protected and prized. To achieve this deathly pallor, Isabeau's vanity was filled with jars of ceruse. Ceruse was a mixture of white lead and vinegar. It smoothed over the scars of childhood smallpox. It hid the exhaustion of sleepless nights. It also, slowly, ate away at the user's life. As Isabeau applied the paste, the lead particles entered her pores, traveling into her bloodstream. It caused her breath to sour, her teeth to loosen, and her nerves to fray. "You look like a statue of marble," Catherine remarked, admiring her work. Isabeau touched her cheek. The skin felt stiff, like a mask that might crack if she dared to smile. But she didn't need to smile. She only needed to be a masterpiece. The pressure of divine expectation. The pressure was not merely physical, it was psychological. In the royal courts of Europe, a bride's beauty was a diplomatic currency. A fair daughter could secure a treaty, end a war, or double the size of a kingdom. If Isabeau failed to meet the standard, if she appeared earthly or common, she was failing her lineage. Every morning began with the litany of the mirror, a series of cold washes in vinegar and rosewater to tighten the skin, a careful application of crushed gemstones and honey to make the eye sparkle, a restrictive binding of the waist to ensure the heavy fur-lined surcoats would hang perfectly from her frame. The medieval bride was a living icon. She was dressed in layers of silk so stiff that they could stand on their own, adorned with gold thread that scratched her raw neck, and crowned with a hennin that made her neck ache with every step. She was a bird in a gilded cage, but the cage was made of her own clothing and cosmetics. As the sun set over the Burgundian hills, Isabeau sat in the darkening room. Her scalp throbbed from the plucking, her skin felt tight and poisoned by the lead, her stomach cramped from the vinegar-soaked cotton balls she swallowed to keep her appetite suppressed. She looked at the altar of aesthetics and offered her final prayer of the day. She didn't pray for happiness or for love. She prayed that the Duke would find her beautiful enough to be useful. In the Middle Ages, for a woman of high birth, beauty was the only price she could pay for safety, and Isabeau was prepared to pay until she had nothing left. The Lily and the Rose. In the courts of the 14th century, a woman's face was not merely a face, it was a map of her social standing. To look upon a noble bride was to look upon a garden of metaphors. The poets sang of the lily and the rose, the white of the skin and the red of the lips. But behind the poetry lay a harsh socio-economic reality. For the American listener, it is easy to mistake this for mere vanity. In reality, it was a brutal branding of the leisure class. The architecture of paleness. Why was white skin the ultimate obsession? The answer was found in the mud of the fields. To be tanned, to have your skin kissed by the sun, was a mark of the peasantry. It meant you labored, it meant you bled, it meant you were tethered to the earth. But a bride of high birth was expected to be as translucent as fine parchment. Her paleness shouted to the world, "I have never seen the sun. I have never pulled a weed. I am protected, precious, and pure." But nature is rarely so cooperative. Lady Isabeau, now deep in the preparations for her wedding, stared at a small blemish on her chin. To the common eye, it was nothing. To her lady-in-waiting, it was a catastrophe. In the medieval mind, a blemish was seen as a leak of the internal humors, a sign that the woman's soul was not in perfect balance. To correct this, the lily had to be manufactured. The alchemy of the kitchen and the crypt. The morning ritual began with the washing of the light. Isabeau's skin was scrubbed with a mixture of crushed pearls and distilled rainwater. If pearls were too expensive, the apothecaries recommended something more accessible, the juice of the white lily bulb with the fat of a swan. Imagine the sensation, the cold, greasy slime being rubbed into the pores of a 14-year-old girl while she sits in a drafty stone room. The scent was a mixture of floral water and animal musk, a smell that would define her life. "You must not move," Catherine whispered, dabbing a sponge soaked in sour milk on Isabeau's forehead. The lactic acid acted as a primitive chemical peel, burning away the top layer of skin to reveal the raw, pale flesh beneath. It stung, a sharp, prickling heat, but Isabeau remained still. This was the first layer of her altar. The crimson stain, the price of the rose. If the skin was the lily, the lips and cheeks were the rose. However, this was not the healthy glow of a woman who had just finished a brisk walk. This was a specific, artificial blood-red stain that had to sit precisely atop the white lead paint. To achieve this, the medieval bride turned to insects and minerals. The most prized pigment was kermes, a dye made from the crushed bodies of female scale insects. It was expensive, rare, and stained the skin for days. Catherine took a small ivory brush. She dipped it into a paste of kermes and honey. With the precision of a jeweler, she painted a small bee-stung circle in the center of Isabeau's lips. She did not follow the natural line of the mount. Instead, she created a tiny, pouting O shape, a look of perpetual innocence and surprise. Then came the cheeks. A bride's blush was not meant to look natural. It was meant to look like two perfect circles of fire against a field of snow. But kermes was a luxury.
For the lesser nobility, the rose was achieved through more dangerous means, cinnabar. Cinnabar is a bright red mineral. It is also the primary ore of mercury. As Catherine rubbed the red powder into Isabel's cheekbones, the mercury began its silent work. It seeped through the skin, entering the nervous system. Over months of use, it would lead to tremors, mood swings, and the vapors, which medieval factors often misdiagnosed as female hysteria. The bride was literally losing her mind to maintain her color.
The veins of the nobility. To emphasize the deathly whiteness of the skin, there was one final macabre trick. On the day of the wedding feast, the bride's skin would be so heavily painted with white lead that it looked like a mask. To make this mask look alive and noble, ladies in waiting would take a fine blue pigment, usually ground lapis lazuli or indigo, and paint thin, delicate blue lines across the bride's temples and chest. These were artificial veins. The goal was to make the skin look so thin, so translucent, that the blue blood of her royal lineage was visible to the naked eye. It was a visual lie, a masterpiece of deception designed to prove that the bride was a different species than the commoners who stood outside the cathedral gates. The weight of the gaze. As Isabeau stood, fully painted, she felt the weight of the rose and the lily. Her skin was a cocktail of lead, mercury, arsenic, and insect blood. She could not sweat, or the lead would streak. She could not smile, or the cinnabar would crack. She could not eat, or the kermes on her lips would smudge. She was a living statue, frozen in the pursuit of a divine ideal. In the American context, we often talk about the male gaze, but in 1384, the gaze was communal. Every guest at the wedding would be judging the clarity of her lily and the vibrancy of her rose. If she looked muddy, her father's political alliances might falter. If she looked too red, she might be accused of a lustful temperament. The price of beauty was not just the coins paid to the apothecary, it was the total surrender of her physical comfort. She was a canvas for the state, painted in colors that were slowly killing her. A covenant with death. The chamber was silent, save for the scraping of a bone spatula against a stone mortar. The air was thick with the sharp acidic tang of vinegar, the catalyst for a bride's slow transformation. Lady Isabeau sat motionless, her eyes fixed on a small, ornate jar containing a substance that promised divinity but delivered decay, Venetian ceruse. In the 14th century, this was the diamond of cosmetics. It was a mixture of finely ground white lead and high-grade vinegar, a paste so thick and opaque that it could turn the most sun-damaged skin into a sheet of flawless alabaster. For an American audience today, it is hard to imagine applying a known poison to one's face, but for Isabeau, the fear of being common was far greater than the fear of the grave. Painting the statue. Catherine, the tirewoman, began the ritual. She did not use a brush. She used her fingers, wrapping them in fine silk to avoid absorbing the toxin herself. She began at the forehead, smoothing the heavy, cold paste over Isabeau's freshly plucked hairline. "Close your eyes, my lady, and do not breathe too deeply." The ceruse did not just sit on the skin, it bonded with it. As it dried, it created a mask-like finish that caught the candlelight with a ghostly shimmering gleam. It filled every pore, it smoothed every line, it erased every trace of humanity. By the time Catherine reached the neck and shoulders, Isabeau no longer looked like a girl of 14. She looked like a marble monument carved for a cathedral. But beneath the white gleam, a silent war had begun. The lead was already seeping through the dermis, entering the tiny capillaries and hitching a ride in the bloodstream. It was a slow, invisible invasion. The hidden cost. To the onlookers at the wedding, Isabeau would be a vision of purity. To a modern physician, she would be a patient in crisis. The lead, once inside the body, targets the nervous system first.
As the days of preparation turned into weeks, Isabel began to feel the lead palsy. Her fingers developed a slight, uncontrollable tremor, a vibration she tried to hide by clenching her rosary beads. Her breath, once so sweet as honey, began to carry a metallic foul odor as the lead affected her internal organs. "The vapors," the court physician would say dismissively. "It is merely the excitement of the nuptials." But it wasn't the vapors. It was the deadly gleam doing its work. The lead was attacking her brain, causing bouts of sudden irritability and melancholia. She would sit for hours staring at the wall, her mind clouded by a toxic fog, while her mother praised her for her serene and quiet temperament. This was the irony of medieval beauty. The more perfect a bride appeared, the closer she was to physical collapse. The greatest tragedy of ceruse was its addictive nature. Lead is corrosive. Over time, it eats away at the natural skin, leaving it yellowed, shriveled, and scarred. When Isabel would wash her face at night with rose water, she would see the damage. Her skin looked gray and lifeless. Her reaction? She applied more lead the next morning. She used the poison to hide the damage caused by the poison. It was a cycle of destruction that many noblewomen carried to their early graves. Their skin would eventually turn a permanent sickly ash color, a condition they called the lead taint. To hide this, they would apply layers of makeup so thick that their faces became rigid, unable to show emotion without the paint cracking like a shattered mirror. The wedding night, the unveiling. On the night of her marriage, as the heavy velvet robes were removed, the Duke looked upon his bride. In the dim light of the tallow candles, she was breathtaking. The white leg gave her skin an ethereal radiance, a glow that seemed to come from another world. He did not see the tremors in her hands. He did not smell the metallic decay on her breath. He saw only the lily. Isabel stood there, a 14-year-old girl whose blood was heavy with metal, whose hair was thinning at the temples, and whose life expectancy had been cut in half for the sake of a trend. She was the ultimate sacrifice on the altar of aesthetics. For the medieval bride, beauty was not a lifestyle. It was a slow, gilded suicide. The white lead was her crown and her shroud.
Bloodletting for brilliance. The pursuit of the divine glow reached its most macabre peak not in the apothecary's jar, but in the barber-surgeon's basin. For Lady Isabeau, the white lead was a mask, but the nobility demanded that the whiteness come from within. To be truly beautiful, one had to be drained. This was the ritual of bloodletting for brilliance, a practice where the line between medicine and torture disappeared entirely. The pale philosophy of the humors. In the medieval mind, health and beauty were governed by the four humors. It was believed that a woman's natural redness was a sign of excess heat, a fire of the blood that suggested a wild, unbridled temperament. To be a perfect, submissive, and ethereal bride, that fire had to be extinguished. 3 days before the wedding, the chamber was prepared. It was not filled with flowers, but with cold water, linen bandages, and the faint, swampy smell of the physician's helpers. Isabeau lay back on a wooden chaise, her arm extended and her veins mapped out like a river system. The surgeon, a man with hands smelling of iron and vinegar, adjusted his spectacles. "We must draw the vital heat from the cheeks, my lady," he whispered, "to leave only the purity of the snow." The invitation of the leeches. The first stage was the application of leeches. These were not the common leeches of the pond, but medicinal healers kept in jars of spring water. Catherine, the lady-in-waiting, watched as the surgeon placed the cold, slick creatures onto Isabeau's neck and temples. The sensation was a sharp, rhythmic pinch, a tiny invasion that settled into a dull, pulsing throb. The leeches began to swell, their bodies turning from thin ribbons to heavy, dark grapes as they drank Isabeau's life force.
For the American listener, the horror lies in the silence of the act. Isabeau did not scream. She watched the ceiling, counting the beams of the roof, while her vision began to swim. This was the price of brilliance. As the blood left her face, the natural flush of her youth vanished, replaced by a translucent, ghostly white that no makeup could ever truly replicate. "See," the surgeon remarked, "the rose is retreating. The lily is taking its throne." The controlled bleed. When the leeches were sated and removed, the more aggressive work began. The leeches provided a surface glow, but for a royal wedding, the transformation had to be deeper. The surgeon took a silver lancet, a small razor-sharp blade. He tied a silk cord tightly around Isabeau's upper arm until her veins rose like blue snakes beneath her skin. This was the venesection. With a practiced flick, he opened the vein in the crook of her elbow. The blood did not gush. It flowed in a steady, dark ribbon into a polished pewter bowl. The room grew quiet. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the bride's blood hitting the metal. Isabeau felt a creeping coldness start at her toes and move toward her heart. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing became shallow and delicate, exactly the angelic state that a bride was expected to embody. The goal was to reach a state of near fainting. In the 14th century, a woman who fainted at the altar was not seen as sick. She was seen as overwhelmed by spiritual devotion. In reality, she was simply suffering from acute anemia. The ghost in the mirror. After the ball was half full, the surgeon bound her arm with lavender-scented linen. Isabeau was helped to her feet, though her legs felt like water. She leaned on Catherine, her head spinning, and looked into the steel mirror. The transformation was terrifyingly beautiful. Her skin was no longer skin, it was moonlight. The dark circles under her eyes, emphasized by the blood loss, gave her a hollow, haunting look that was considered deeply romantic and pious. Her lips were faint, bruised lilac. She looked like a woman who was already halfway to heaven. "You are perfect," her mother whispered from the doorway. "The Duke will think he is marrying a saint." The dangers of the drain. But the brilliance came with a physical collapse. By draining her blood, the surgeon had weakened her immune system just as she was about to enter a crowded cathedral filled with people from across the continent. The bloodletting caused a massive drop in blood pressure. Throughout her wedding ceremony, Isabeau would struggle to keep her eyes open. Every step in her heavy, gold-encrusted dress was a battle against gravity. Her heart labored to pump what little fluid remained in her vessels. Furthermore, the tools used were rarely clean. Many brides who sought the leeches' glow ended up with St. Anthony's fire, a raging skin infection, or systemic sepsis. They traded their long-term health for a single day of looking like a porcelain doll. The legacy of the pale bride. As Isabeau sat at the wedding feast, she could not eat the rich meats or drink the spiced wine. Her body was too fragile, her stomach too knotted. She sat as a silent, white specter at the head of the table, the ultimate symbol of a class that was so wealthy they could afford to be physically weak. In the American narrative of history, we often overlook the sheer brutality of fashion. We see the beautiful paintings in museums, but we do not see the pewter bowl of blood hidden under the bed. We do not hear the surgeon's lancet. Isabeau had paid the price. She had bled for her status. She had sacrificed her strength for a brilliance that was in truth the shadow of death. The high forehead of nobility. In the gilded halls of the late Middle Ages, a woman's beauty was measured by the inch, specifically the inches of bare skin that climbed from her eyebrows toward the crown of her head. This was the era of the egg-shaped face. To have a low hairline or thick, unruly temples was to be branded as earthly, a creature of the fields, but to possess a forehead as vast and smooth as a polished altar was to be seen as a woman of intellect, virtue, and high-born grace. The ritual of achieving this look, however, was nothing short of a slow, meticulous torture. The architecture of the ideal skull. For Lady Isabeau, the transformation began at dawn. She sat in a hard-backed chair, her head tilted back, exposed to the harsh morning light streaming through the narrow castle windows. In this period of history, the forehead was considered the seat of the soul. A large forehead suggested an open mind and a pure spirit. To achieve this, the natural hairline had to be systematically destroyed. Catherine, the tire-woman, approached with a tray of instruments that looked more suited for a leather worker than a lady's maid. There were silver tweezers, sharpened pumice stones, and a small bubbling pot of caustic paste. The goal was to move Isabeau's hairline back by nearly 2 to 3 inches, creating a sweeping hairless dome that would eventually be framed by a towering headdress. Arsenic and lime. Before the plucking could begin, the skin had to be prepared, or rather weakened. Catherine applied a depilatory paste to the fine baby hairs at Isabeau's temples. The paste was a terrifying alchemy, a mixture of quicklime and parchment, the latter being a bright yellow arsenic sulfide. As the paste touched Isabeau's skin, the chemical reaction began. It did not merely sit on the surface, it burned. A sharp, searing heat began to radiate across her brow. "Do not flinch, my lady," Catherine warned softly, "or the paste will run and blind you." Isabeau sat like a statue, her eyes watering from the acrid fumes of the arsenic. The paste was designed to kill the hair follicles, making the subsequent plucking easier. But it also ate into the delicate skin of the forehead, leaving behind a raw red welt that would eventually heal into a pale, translucent scar, the very glow that the nobility craved.
The agony of the tweezers. After the chemicals had done their work, the manual labor began. This was the most intimate and agonizing part of the process. One by one, hair by hair, Catherine began to pluck. Tug, snap, tug, snap. The sound was tiny, but in the silence of the stone chamber, it echoed in Isabeau's ears like the cracking of bone. The most painful areas were the temples, where the skin is thinnest and the nerves are most sensitive. Each pull sent a jolt of electricity through Isabeau's skull. To the American listener, it might seem like a small price to pay, a mere grooming habit. But this was not the eyebrow threading of the modern world. This was the removal of thousands of hairs from the root across several square inches of the scalp, repeated every week to prevent the shameful appearance of stubble. By the second hour, Isabeau's forehead was a weeping, inflamed battlefield. Her scalp throbbed with a rhythmic fever, yet she remained silent. In the medieval court, a bride's stoicism during the beautification was considered a test of her character. If she could endure the silver tweezers, she could endure the trials of a political marriage, the erasure of the brows. But the forehead was not enough. To complete the ethereal look, the eyebrows also had to be addressed. In the 14th and 15th centuries, thick eyebrows were seen as masculine and deceptive. A virtuous bride was expected to have no brows at all, or at most a line so faint it was barely visible from across a room. Catherine took a smaller set of pliers. With the same ruthless precision, she plucked the eyebrows until the bone beneath was bare. The result was a face that looked perpetually surprised, perpetually innocent, and utterly stripped of its ability to express anger or dissent.
By removing the eyebrows, the patriarchy of the medieval court effectively silenced the bride's face. She became a blank canvas, a tabula rasa, upon which the duke could project his own desires. The hennin. The final insult to the bride's suffering was the hennin, the iconic cone-shaped headdress that could reach heights of 3 feet. Once the forehead was plucked and the skin was raw, Catherine would pull the remaining hair back so tightly that it distorted the shape of Isabeau's eyes. She then pinned the heavy wire-framed hennin directly into the hair and sometimes through the fabric of the undercap, which sat atop the inflamed skin. The weight of the velvet, the gold embroidery, and the sheer height of the hat put an immense strain on the neck and the newly plucked scalp. Every movement was a risk. If Isabeau turned her head too quickly, the weight of the hennin would pull at her newly raw forehead, threatening to tear the healing skin. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, not because she was regal, but because she was in constant, agonizing pain. The virtue of the void. As the sun reached its zenith, the ritual was complete. Isabeau looked into the polished steel. Her face appeared elongated, ghostly, and alien. Her forehead was a vast, white expanse, a virtuous void. To the world, she was the height of fashion. To her family, she was a masterpiece of discipline. But as she touched the weeping skin of her hairline, she felt the true price of her nobility. She had traded her natural form for a divine geometry. In our modern world, we often speak of snatching hair or shaping faces, but for the medieval bride, the high forehead was a literal carving of the self. It was a daily reminder that to be a woman of the leisure class, one had to be willing to be dismantled, hair by hair, layer by layer, until nothing human remained. Belladonna, the beautiful death. Of all the toxins used in the name of medieval allure, none were so poetic or so treacherous as the extract of the Atropa belladonna. Its name literally translates to beautiful woman, but among the apothecaries who whispered of its power, it was known by a darker title, the deadly nightshade. For a bride like Isabeau, whose wedding was a performance of romantic devotion, the eyes were the final frontier. They had to be wide, watery, and endlessly deep, a look of permanent, soul-shattering love. But to achieve this romantic gaze, she had to invite the shadow of blindness into her very pupils. The anatomy of the gaze. In the courts of Europe, the eyes were considered the windows to the soul. A bride with small, constricted pupils was viewed with suspicion, as if she were cold, calculating, or unloving. However, a woman with large, dark, dilated pupils was seen as consumed by passion. It was a physiological lie, a trick of the nerves that the medieval world mistook for spiritual ecstasy. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the eve of her wedding, Catherine prepared for the baptism of the eyes. She sat in the center of her chamber, away from the flickering hearth, while Catherine produced a small, dark violet vial. "One drop for the father," Catherine murmured, her voice trembling slightly, "and one for the son." The chemistry of the nightshade. The liquid inside was a tincture of belladonna, a potent alkaloid that works by paralyzing the muscles of the iris. For an American listener, we know this today as atropine, used by eye doctors in controlled, sterile environments. But for Isabeau, there was no control. There was only the dropper and the dark. As the liquid touched the surface of her eye, a cold, stinging sensation rippled through her skull. It was not a sharp pain like the lead or the arsenic. It was a deep, dull ache that seemed to vibrate behind her brain. Within minutes, the chemistry of the nightshade began its work. Isabeau's pupils expanded, widening until the colorful iris was swallowed by a void of pitch black. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. As her pupils dilated to their absolute limit, her ability to focus vanished. The room, once sharp and stone-cold, became a blur of golden light and gray shadows. This was the watery gaze so prized by medieval poets, a look of soft, unfocused vulnerability. But for the bride, it was the world of ghosts. "I cannot see your face, Catherine," Isabeau whispered, her hands grasping the edge of her velvet chair. "You do not need to see, my lady. You only need to be seen." This was the core tragedy of the belladonna bride. She was a spectator to her own wedding who was functionally blind. She could not see the faces of the guests. She could not see the steps of the altar. She could not see the expression of the man she was marrying. She was trapped in a shimmering golden haze, stumbling through her vows while the nightshade poisoned her optic nerves.
The risk of the permanent dark. The price of the beautiful death was not merely a temporary blur. Belladonna is a cumulative poison. With every application, the pressure inside the eye could rise, leading to what we now recognize as glaucoma. Prolonged use led to permanent light sensitivity, making the sun feel like a dagger to the brain, and eventually, total blindness. Furthermore, the belladonna entered the systemic circulation. As Isabeau stood at the altar, her heart began to race, a side effect of the toxin. Her mouth went dry, her skin became flushed, and she began to experience hallucinations. Imagine the scene: a teenage bride, poisoned by lead, weakened by bloodletting, and now hallucinating shadows on the cathedral walls while she cannot see the floor beneath her feet. To the onlookers, her swaying and her wide, dark eyes were signs of holy trembling. In reality, she was in the throes of anticholinergic poisoning. The shroud of the veil. There is a cruel irony in the history of the bridal veil. While it was said to represent modesty, for many noble brides it served a more practical purpose. It shielded their dilated, light-sensitive eyes from the blinding glare of the cathedral candles. Isabeau moved like a ghost through the incense-heavy air. Every flicker of a candle was a burst of white pain in her brain. She held her father's arm not out of affection, but as a literal lifeline, for she could not see where the floor ended and the stairs began. She was the beautiful Geth incarnate, a woman who had sacrificed her vision to ensure that the Duke saw only love in her eyes. The legacy of the blind bride. As the bells of the cathedral rang out, signaling the union, Isabeau stared into the void. She had achieved the romantic gaze. Her eyes were vast, dark pools that reflected nothing but the light of the candles she could not truly see. In the modern world, we value vision as a sign of power. In the medieval world, a bride's power lay in her willingness to be blinded. The belladonna was the final layer of her mask, a chemical veil that ensured she would walk into her new life with her eyes wide open, and yet seeing nothing at all. Mercury in the mirror. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man: mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver.
To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century meant any blemish, freckle, or scar. For a bride-to-be like Isabeau, a single pimple was not just a skin condition, it was a spiritual failure. It was a mark of the devil or an imbalance of the bile. To save her skin for the wedding mirror, she turned to the most corrosive elements known to man, mercury and arsenic. The mirror's deception. In the flickering shadows of the apothecary's back room, there sat a substance that defied the laws of nature. It was a liquid that acted like a solid, a metal that flowed like water. They called it quicksilver. To the medieval eye, mercury was magical, a divine silver blood that promised to wash away the sins of the flesh, which in the 14th century...
The reflections of a bride. As Isabel stood before the Duke at the altar, she was a chemical masterpiece. Her eyes were dilated with belladonna, her blood was thinned by leeches, and her skin was a fragile crust of lead hiding the mercury-eroded flesh beneath. She was a triumph of 14th century science and a victim of its ignorance. In the modern world, we look into the mirror and see our flaws as things to be fixed. We use acids and peels, unaware that we are the descendants of women who used quicksilver and arsenic. Isabel's story is a reminder that the price of beauty is often paid in the currency of our own health. She had sought to save her skin for the mirror, only to find that the mirror had stolen her life. Stained lips and crimson cost. In the cold clinical light of history, we often view the medieval bride as a pale, bloodless specter. But there was one feature that had to burn with the intensity of a dying sun: the lips. A bride's mouth was the rose of Sharon, a symbol of her fertility and her speechlessness. Yet, to achieve that perfect blood-red pout, Lady Isabel had to paint her smile with a mixture of crushed life and lethal earth. This was the crimson cost, where every smile was a mask and every kiss was a gamble with the grave. The alchemy of the insect. The morning of the wedding was a flurry of scarlet. Catherine, the lady-in-waiting, did not reach for a simple tube of wax. She reached for a leather pouch filled with the dried, shriveled bodies of the Kermes beetle. To the American ear, the idea of crushing insects for beauty sounds primitive. Yet, this was the height of luxury. Thousands of female insects had to be gathered from Mediterranean oaks, dried in the sun, and ground into a fine crimson dust. "The blood of the earth for the blood of the bride," Catherine whispered, mixing the beetle dust with sheep pat and honey. As the paste was applied, the smell was earthy and metallic. The Kermes dye was a deep, honest red, but it had a flaw. It faded under the heat of the breath. To make the rose permanent, to make it stay through the long hours of the cathedral mass, the apothecary required something much more sinister. The dragon's breath, cinnabar, and sulfur. To give the lips a vibrant, unnatural pop that could be seen from the back of the chapel, the kermes was often fortified with cinnabar. Cinnabar is a volcanic mineral, a bright orange-red stone that is the primary ore of mercury. In the 14th century, it was nicknamed dragon's blood. When ground into a lip tint, it provided a luster that no insect could match. But as Isabel licked her lips, or as she breathed through the heavy layers of paint, she was ingesting pure, unadulterated mercury. The crimson cost was immediate. The cinnabar would irritate the delicate membranes of the mouth, causing the lips to swell. To the Duke and the wedding guests, this swelling looked like a sensual pout, a sign of youth and vigor. In reality, it was an acute inflammatory response to a heavy metal. Isabel's mouth was literally burning, the skin stretching until it cracked, requiring even more poisonous paste to fill the fissures. The danger of every kiss. The medieval wedding was a ceremony of the peace. At several points, the bride was expected to offer a kiss to the cross, to her father, and finally to her new husband. But for the painted bride, the kiss was a delivery system of toxin. Imagine the irony. The Duke leans in to claim his pure bride, and as their lips meet, he receives a trace amount of mercury and lead from her face. This was the deadly kiss of the nobility. Historians often wonder if the strange, erratic behaviors of medieval kings were not just exacerbated by their own paints, but by the cosmetics of the women they embraced. Isabel felt the weight of the paint. It was heavy, sticky, and tasted of burnt sugar and copper. She was forbidden from eating or drinking during the ceremony, for any smudge would reveal the gray, mercury-scarred skin beneath the red. She was a prisoner of her own smile. The theological trap of the red mouth. While the apothecary sold the red, the church condemned it. Priests preached that a woman who painted her lips was seeking to improve upon God's handiwork, a sin of pride that led straight to the fires of hell. Do you wish to enter the bridal chamber as a daughter of Eve or a daughter of the serpent? The bishop had asked her during confession. This created a psychological torture for the bride. She was told she must be beautiful to honor her family, but she was told she was sinful for using the only tools that made her so. Isabel sat in the cathedral, her lips stained with the blood of dragons, feeling the weight of eternal damnation with every breath. She was trapped between the social demand for the rose and the religious fear of the flame. The rot beneath the rose. By the end of the wedding night, the crimson cost would be fully paid. When the heavy paints were finally wiped away with oil and wool, the truth was revealed. Because mercury and arsenic tints destroyed the natural collagen, the lips of frequent users would become thin, bluish, and covered in small, weeping sores. The very fullness they sought with the paint was permanently stolen by the chemicals. Isabel looked into her dark mirror after the guests had gone. Her lips looked bruised, not from a kiss, but from the corrosion. To appear beautiful for one day, she had surrendered the health of her smile for a lifetime. The legacy of the stained lip. For the modern American listener, lipstick is a triviality, a 5-minute ritual. But for the medieval bride, it was a lethal commitment. It was the use of crust life and volcanic poison to create a signal of fertility that her body could no longer truly sustain. Isabel's rose was a lie. It was a beautiful crimson scar, a mark of a society that valued the color of a woman's lips more than the words that came through them. As she lay down for her first night as a duchess, the metallic taste of cinnabar remained on her tongue, a lingering reminder that in the Middle Ages, beauty was a hunger that ate the woman alive. The Saffron Glow.
In the visual language of the 14th century, to be blonde was to be holy. The golden hair of the Virgin Mary and the radiant manes of the archangels had set a standard that nature rarely meant for the women of Burgundy. Dark hair was seen as earthly and heavy, but gold was the color of the sun, the color of coins, and the color of God's favor. For Lady Isabel, whose hair was a natural, stubborn chestnut, achieving the saffron glow was not a matter of style. It was a brutal chemical penance. The altar of the cellorium. The transformation didn't happen in the shadows of the bedchamber. It happened on the rooftops. To become an angelic bride, she had to undergo the cellorium bleach. She was led to the cellorium, a flat stone terrace exposed to the unforgiving heat of the summer sun. But the sun alone was not enough to strip the color from her tresses. The hair had to be primed with a mixture that would make a modern chemist recoil. Catherine, her loyal shadow, prepared the golden water. It was a pungent, stinging cocktail of alum, wood ash, and most crucially, concentrated saffron mixed with stale sulfurous urine. "The blood of the earth for the blood of the bride," Catherine whispered, midst into beetle dust with sheep's fat and honey. As the paste was applied, the smell was earthy and metallic. The Kermes dye was a deep, honest red, but it had a flaw. It faded under the heat of the breath. To make the rose permanent, to make it stay through the long hours of the cathedral mass, the apothecary required something much more sinister.
For hours upon hours, Isabeau sat motionless on the stone terrace. The American listener must imagine the physical toll, the heat radiating from the stones, the flies attracted to the saffron and honey in the mixture, and the agonizing fumes of the sulfur rising into her nostrils. Her scalp began to itch, a deep crawling burn as the wood ash and alum ate into her skin. But to move was to ruin the glow, the saffron deception. Saffron was the most expensive spice in the world, literally worth its weight in gold. By using it in her hair, Isabeau was displaying her family's immense wealth. The saffron didn't just dye the hair, it coated it in a shimmering yellow-orange resin that glowed like a halo when caught by the light. But there was a price beyond the coin. The constant application of acidic bleaches made the hair incredibly brittle. As Catherine combed through the tresses after a day in the sun, handfuls of hair would snap off at the root. "It is merely the old life leaving you," Catherine lied, hiding the clumps of chestnut hair in her apron. By the time the wedding arrived, Isabeau's hair was no longer a soft, living thing. It was a dry, straw-like construct, held together by animal fats and silk threads, but to the world it was a heavenly mane, the fever of the gold. The saffron glow often led to more than just broken hair. The hours of sun exposure on the rooftops frequently resulted in sunstroke or the golden fever. Brides would arrive at their wedding ceremonies with pounding migraines and blistered scalps, hidden beneath their heavy jeweled veils. As Isabeau stood in the cool, dark cathedral, the contrast was a shock to her system. Her scalp felt like it was still on fire from the wood ash, and the weight of her crown pressed down on the chemical burns at her hairline. She felt a dizzying nausea, the price of the sun, but she kept her chin high. To the Duke, her slightly flushed face and her shimmering yellow-gold hair made her look like a saint descending from a stained glass window. He did not know that if he touched her hair too roughly, it would crumble like dried parchment in his fingers. The vanishing halo. The tragedy of the saffron glow was its fleeting nature. Within weeks, the vibrant yellow would fade into a dull, brassy orange. The scalp, damaged by the caustic mixtures, would often break out in sores or suffer from permanent thinning. Isabeau looked into her mirror weeks after the ceremony. The angelic gold was gone, leaving behind a head of hair that was scarred and broken. She had reached for the sun, and like Icarus, she had been burned by the very thing she sought to master. The legacy of the Golden Bride. For the modern world, going blonde is a trip to the salon. For the medieval bride, it was a sacrificial rite. It was an attempt to turn the physical body into a divine metaphor, using fire, acid, and the most precious spices on earth. Isabeau's hair was a testament to her status, a golden shroud that announced her purity to the world while masking the pain of her scorched skin. In the Middle Ages, beauty was never natural. It was a labored, expensive, and often painful construction of the self. The saffron glow was the final light of her maidenhood, a flame that burned bright for one day and left nothing but ashes in its wake. The corset of iron and bone. In the visual hierarchy of the late 14th century, a woman's body was considered not her own. It was an architectural project. The ideal noble silhouette was not one of health or vitality, but of a rigid, ethereal geometry. To be a bride of status, Lady Isabeau had to be reshaped literally. Her ribs had to be bent, her chest flattened, and her spine forced into a permanent, unnatural arch. This was the era of the corset of iron and bone, where fashion was not a choice, but a cage designed to erase the woman and leave only the statue. The engineering of submission. On the morning of the final fitting, the air in the chamber was thick with the scent of tension and starched linen. Catherine produced the corps piqué, the stiffened bodice that would serve as Isabeau's second skin. This was not the flexible elastic of the modern world. It was a construction of heavy, multi-layered canvas, reinforced with baleen, the flexible yet incredibly strong bone of the whale, and in some extreme cases, thin plates of forged iron. "Breathe out, my lady," she commanded, "and do not seek to breathe in again until the laces are set." As the silk cords were threaded through the silver eyelets, Isabeau felt the world begin to shrink. The corset was designed to force the torso into a perfect inverted cone. With every tug of the lace, her internal organs were shifted, pushed upward toward her throat or downward into her pelvis. It was a slow, deliberate crushing of the self. The erasure of the breast. In the medieval theology of beauty, a female form was a site of temptation that had to be neutralized. A prominent chest was seen as peasant-like and overly fertile, a mark of the common woman. A noble bride, however, was expected to be as flat and smooth as a marble pillar. The corset worked as a flattening press. The heavy whalebone stayed across the front of the chest, pinning the breasts against the ribcage with such force that the skin often bruised. For the American listener, the horror is in the permanence of the act. Long-term use of these garments did not just move fat, it deformed the skeletal structure. Over years, the lower ribs would fold inward, permanently narrowing the waist, but leaving the bride with a lung capacity so diminished that she lived in a state of perpetual oxygen deprivation. A chemical illusion. When Isabeau finally stood before the cathedral, she was a masterpiece of mystical restraint. Her face was pale, not just from the white lead, but from the fact that she could only take shallow, gasping sips of air. This is the hidden truth behind the fainting bride trope of history. A woman who collapsed at the altar was often seen as overcome by spiritual ecstasy or the weight of the sacrament. In reality, it was mechanical suffocation. The iron and bone would not allow the diaphragm to expand. If the bride's heart rate rose due to nerves, her body would demand oxygen that the corset refused to provide. She was a bird with clipped wings, held upright only by the metal plates stitched into her silk. The internal war. The damage was not merely on the surface. Historians and paleopathologists examining the remains of noblewomen from this era have found evidence of corset ribs, bones that had grown in a zigzag pattern due to the pressure. For Isabeau, the pain was a constant dull throb in her lower back. The corset of the corset would dig into her hips, creating raw sores that would often fester under the layers of heavy velvet. Because she was a bride, she was expected to dance, to feast, and to kneel for hours in prayer, all while encased in a shell that made it impossible to sit or bend naturally. Every movement was a calculated risk. If she moved too quickly, a whalebone might snap, or worse, the pressure on her stomach would cause her to vomit, a shameful display that she prevented by starving herself for days leading up to the ceremony. The silhouette of silence. When the Duke looked at his bride, he saw a miracle of symmetry. He saw a waist he could span with his hands, and a chest as flat and pure as a boy's. He did not know that if he touched her hair too roughly, it would crumble like dried parchment in his fingers.
The legacy of the girded bride. As Isabeau lay down on her wedding night, the removal of the corset was almost as painful as the wearing of it. As the pressure was released, her blood rushed back into her compressed organs, causing a dizzying, painful sensation known as the reawakening. She was left with a body that was perfect by the standards of the 14th century, but broken by the standards of nature. The price of beauty was the surrender of her own breath. She had been shaped by the hand of the tailor and the fire of the blacksmith, a bride of iron in a world of glass. Fragrance amidst the filth. In the modern world, we associate the bride with the scent of fresh lilies or light citrus, but in the 14th century, the bridal chamber smelled of the hunt, the sea, and the crypt. This was the era of fragrance amidst the filth, a time when the nobility believed that water opened the pores to the pestilence of the world, and that the only way to remain clean was to be buried under layers of animalistic musk. For Lady Isabeau, her wedding day was not a celebration of freshness, but a strategic masking of the human body. The terror of the tub. A century earlier, bathing had been a social ritual. But as the Black Death swept across Europe, a new medical theory took hold, the miasma. Doctors claimed that hot water softened the skin and opened the gates of the body, allowing the plague to enter. Consequently, for the 6 months leading up to her wedding, Isabeau had not submerged her body in water. Instead, her cleansing was a dry ritual. Catherine would rub Isabeau's skin with linen cloths soaked in rosewater or strong vinegar. This removed the surface oils, but did nothing for the deep, persistent musk of a body living in heavy wool and velvet. To compensate for this natural reality, the bride had to become a walking incense burner. The alchemy of musk and ambergris. To the American listener, the ingredients of medieval perfume sound like a list of ingredients for a sorcerer's potion. The two most prized scents were musk and ambergris. Musk was a pungent secretion from the glands of the musk deer, a heavy, earthy scent that signaled raw, animal power. Ambergris, even more mysterious, was a waxy substance coughed up by sperm whales and aged by the salt of the ocean. Catherine took a small golden pomander, a perforated metal ball, and filled it with a paste of these substances mixed with crushed cloves and cinnamon. She hung it from Isabeau's waist. "The scent must be thick enough to choke a ghost," Catherine remarked, "for the Duke must smell your wealth before he sees your face." The sensory shroud. As Isabeau was dressed, layer upon layer of perfume was applied. It was not just on her skin, it was in her hair, stitched into the linings of her sleeves and rubbed into the leather of her shoes. The result was an overwhelming sensory shroud. As she walked, a cloud of musk and ambergris preceded her. It was so thick that it made her eyes water and her throat close. But this was the price of hygiene. The perfume was not meant to be pretty, it was meant to be a barrier.
It was a chemical wall built between the bride and the perceived filth of the physical world. The danger of the heavy scent. While these perfumes hid the lack of bathing, they brought their own physical toll. Musk and ambergris are powerful allergens and neurotoxins in high concentrations. Throughout the wedding ceremony, Isabeau lived in a state of perfume fever. The combination of the heavy scents, the lack of oxygen from her corset, and the heat of the cathedral candles created a dizzying effect. She felt as though she were floating in a thick, oily sea. Furthermore, the use of civet, another animal secretion, was known to cause skin irritations and rashes. Underneath her gold thread sleeves, Isabel's arms were covered in red, itchy welts where the concentrated oils had touched her skin. She could not scratch. She could not move. She could only exist within the suffocating cloud of her own sweetness. The marriage of scents. When the Duke finally approached her, the air between them became a battleground of odors. He, too, was covered in the scents of the forest and the pharmacy. This was the medieval harmony. Two bodies, unwashed for months, colliding in a haze of whale vomit and deer gland extracts. To the observers, this was the height of sophistication. To a modern nose, it would have been unbearable. But in 1384, this was the smell of power. A person who smelled like an animal was a person who could afford the rarest imports of the East. The legacy of the masked body. As the wedding night arrived and the layers of silk and scent were finally stripped away, the reality of the filth remained. The perfumes had not cleaned Isabeau. They had only silenced her body's natural language. In the modern world, we spend billions on soaps and sanitizers, but we are the heirs of Isabeau's pomander. We still use musk in our most expensive colognes, forgetting that it began as a desperate shield against the fear of water and the reality of the plague. Isabeau's scent was her final mask. It was a beautiful, expensive lie told to the nose to distract from the truth of the skin. She was a bride of ambergris, a woman who had traded the clarity of water for the heavy, suffocating glory of the perfume jar. The bridal trousseau's weight. In the modern American mind, a wedding dress is a cloud of tulle and lace, a light, airy garment designed for dancing. But for Lady Isabeau in the 14th century, the bridal trousseau was a physical burden equivalent to a soldier's plate armor. To be the center of a royal wedding was to be buried alive in wealth. This was the bridal trousseau's weight, a display of family power that could weigh up to 50 pounds, turning the bride's walk down the aisle into a feat of agonizing endurance. The loom of gravity. The construction of the gown began months in advance, using the heaviest fabrics the world could provide. The base was not thin silk, but samite, a thick wefted silk reinforced with gold and silver threads so dense they made the fabric stand upright on its own. Catherine and 4 other maids struggled to lift the overgown from its cedar chest. It was a surcoat lined entirely with the winter pelts of hundreds of ermines. "Stand firm, my lady," Catherine whispered, bracing herself as she lowered the garment over Isabeau's head. As the fabric settled on Isabeau's shoulders, she felt a sharp downward jerk, as if a heavy hand had been placed upon her head, pushing her into the floor. The weight of the gold embroidery alone, depicting lions and lilies in raised couching stitch, was enough to strain the neck muscles within minutes. The geometry of pain. Every element of the trousseau added a new layer of pressure. The sleeves were long and pendant, trailing on the ground, weighted at the ends with lead pellets to ensure they hung in perfect, straight lines. Then came the jewels. These were not light modern crystals. They were raw rubies, sapphires, and pearls, set in heavy gold enclosing frames. They were sewn directly on the chest and shoulders of the gown.
Imagine the sensation. 50 pounds of velvet, fur, gold, and stone, all supported by a teenage girl whose blood had been thinned by leeches and whose lungs were compressed by an iron corset. Isabeau took her first step. Her knees buckled. To walk in such a garment required a specific shuffling gait. She could not lift her feet. She had to glide, using her entire core strength to keep the momentum of the heavy velvet moving forward. The spinal toll. The price of this weight was measured in the bones. The human spine is not designed to support 50 extra pounds concentrated on the shoulders for 10 to 12 hours. Throughout the wedding mass, which lasted for 3 hours of standing and kneeling, Isabeau felt her vertebrae begin to compress. A sharp, burning pain radiated from the base of her neck down to her lower back. But because of the iron corset beneath, she could not slouch. She was held in a vertical vice, crushed between the internal pressure of the stays and the external weight of the gold. "Do not bow your head," her mother hissed from the front pew. "A duchess does not bend." By the middle of the ceremony, Isabeau's legs began to go numb. The heavy skirts restricted her circulation, and the sheer heat generated by the ermine fur under the burning cathedral candles caused her to sweat profusely. But the sweat had nowhere to go. It was trapped against her skin, mixing with the white lead paint and the heavy musks, creating a stifling, toxic microclimate inside her clothing. The crown of heaviness. The final burden was the coronal, the bridal crown. It was a circle of solid gold encrusted with tall, pointed fleur-de-lis and weighed down by uncut emeralds. It did not sit lightly on her head. It pressed into the raw, red skin where her hairline had been plucked. Every time she moved her head, the crown shifted, pulling at her scalp and sending stabs of pain through her temples. For the American listener, the image of a fairy tale wedding is shattered here. Isabeau was not a princess in a dream. She was a pack animal in a cathedral. She was a living display case for her father's treasury, and her body was the shelf that had to hold it all without breaking. The exhaustion of the feast. When the ceremony ended, the ordeal was far from over. She had to sit through a 6-hour banquet. In the heavy trousseau, sitting was almost impossible. The stiffened front of the gown pushed up against her chin, and the weight of the skirts pulled at her waist. She could not eat. She could barely breathe. She sat as a silent, gilded monument, while the guests celebrated a union she was too physically exhausted to even comprehend. The legacy of the gilded burden. As the night finally ended and the gown was unpinned, a process that took nearly an hour, Isabeau's body collapsed. Her shoulders were bruised purple from the weight of jewels. Her back was locked in a painful spasm that would take days to release. In history books, we see the beautiful, stiff portraits of medieval queens. We admire the richness of their attire, but we rarely consider the physics of their fashion. Isabeau's dress was a testament to her power, but it was also a weapon used against her. It ensured she could not run, could not move freely, and could not forget for 1 second the weight of her new station. The price of beauty was the literal crushing of her frame, a golden burden she would carry in her spirit long after the dress was returned to its chest. Herbal alchemy and kitchen cosmetics. While the apothecary's shop offered the deadly gleam of minerals, the medieval bride also looked to the earth, the garden, and the farmyard for her salvation. This was the world of herbal alchemy and kitchen cosmetics, a realm where beauty was brewed in copper pots and distilled in the pale light of the moon. For Lady d'Isabeau, these safer remedies were her only respite from the poisons, yet even here the price was an endless cycle of labor and the desperate hope that a crushed flower could fix what a harsh life had broken. The still room secrets.
Every great castle had a still room, a laboratory where the boundaries between cooking, medicine, and magic blurred. Here the lady of the house was the master chemist. Before the wedding, Isabeau spent hours watching Catherine simmer concoctions that smelled of meadows and damp earth. The philosophy was simple: like cures like. If a bride wanted skin as white as a lily, she must use the heart of the lily. If she wanted the softness of a newborn, she must bathe in the fluids of birth. "Nature holds the key, my lady," Catherine would say, stirring a thick, milky broth. "But nature is a shy mistress. She must be coaxed out with fire and patience." The baptism of rain and milk. The base of all kitchen cosmetics was the pure water, not the water from the castle well, which was often brackish and hard, but May dew or August rain. It was believed that water collected from the leaves of plants before sunrise held the vital spirit of the earth. Isabeau's morning began with a wash of this distilled dew, mixed with warm goat's milk. For the American listener, this sounds like a luxurious spa treatment. In 1384, however, goat's milk was used for its lactic acid, a natural exfoliant that slowly, painfully nibbled away at the dead skin cells. But milk alone was not enough. To bleach the skin without using lead, Catherine created a paste of crushed white lilies and bean flour. Isabeau would wear this thick, doughy mask for hours, her face stiffening as the flour dried. It was safe, it was organic, but it was often useless against the deep scars of the era. It provided a temporary glow, a maiden's flush that vanished the moment the bride stepped into the cold wind. The alchemy of the orchard. Fruits and vegetables were the paints of the lower nobility. While Isabeau used kermes beetle for her lips, on quieter days she used the juice of crushed strawberries or the rinds of pomegranates. There was a frantic, almost desperate quality to these kitchen rituals. One recipe called for the distilled water of a young calf's foot to remove wrinkles. Another suggested rubbing the face with a warm halved onion to draw out bad humors. Isabeau endured them all. She sat with sliced cucumbers on her eyes, not for relaxation, but because she was told they would shrink the veins dilated by her belladonna drops. She rubbed her teeth with the ashes of burnt rosemary and powdered cuttlefish bone, a gritty, abrasive ritual that polished the enamel but left her gums raw and rad. The superstition of the bloom. The alchemy was not just about ingredients, it was about timing. A lotion made during the waning moon was thought to reduce a swelling, while one made during the waxing moon would blunt the cheeks. This added a layer of psychological stress to the bride's preparation. If a blemish appeared, Isabeau did not just blame her diet, she blamed the stars. Had the rainwater been collected too late? Had the goat been stressed? This safer side of beauty was a trap of infinite variables. It gave the bride the illusion of control while keeping her tethered to the kitchen and the garden. It was a domestic prison where every flower was a potential cure and every failure was a sign of her own spiritual impurity. The uselessness of the gentle. As the wedding day approached, the limitations of herbal alchemy became clear. The crushed lilies could not hide the gray tint of the lead poisoning. The goat's milk could not soothe the chemical burns from the arsenic lotions. In the end, the kitchen cosmetics were merely the base, a way to prepare the canvas for the deadlier paints. Isabeau would wash with the finest rose water, only to cover it with the deadly gleam of ceruse. Isabeau stood in her chamber, smelling of roses and sour milk, a girl of the earth trying to become a girl of the heavens. She was a practitioner of herbal alchemy, a scientist of the kitchen who paid for her beauty with hours of boiling, grinding, and waiting. In the medieval age, even the safe path was a mountain of labor, and the lily was a dream that required a lifetime of effort to catch. The church's wrath.
In the 14th century, the cathedral was the highest authority, and its shadow fell long over the dressing table. While the nobility demanded a bride look like an angel, the clergy warned that the tools she used were forged in the fires of hell. This was the church's wrath, a theological war against the painted face. For Lady Isabeau, every stroke of the lead brush was not just a cosmetic choice, it was a potential act of heresy, an insult to the Creator who had already fashioned her in His image. The sin of the second face. The medieval church viewed the human body as a sacred vessel. To alter that vessel, to whiten the skin, to redden the lips, or to pluck the brow was seen as an act of supreme arrogance. The priests called it adulterating the work of God. If God wished you to be white as the lily, He would have made you so. To paint a second face over the one God gave you is to tell the Almighty that His craftsmanship,
The mirror as the devil's portal. In the eyes of the church, the mirror was not a neutral object. It was a portal of vanity. Many woodcuts of the era depicted the devil holding a mirror for a noblewoman, whispering secrets of lead and mercury into her ear. For Isabeau, the ritual of the mirror became a source of intense guilt. Every time Catherine applied the kerme to her lips, Isabeau remembered the priest's warning that the mouth painted with the blood of beetles will speak only the language of lies. The very tools that made her a virtuous bride in the eyes of the duke made her a sinner in the eyes of the bishop. This psychological tension was the invisible price of beauty, a constant gnawing fear that her pursuit of an earthly crown would cost her a heavenly one. The theology of corruption. The clergy's hatred of makeup was not just moral, it was practical. They observed the lead taint and the mercury madness we have discussed in earlier chapters. However, instead of seeing these as chemical poisonings, they saw them as divine punishments. When a bride's teeth began to rot from mercury, the priest did not blame the lotion, he blamed the sin of pride rotting her from within. When the lead ceruse caused her skin to wither, it was described as the soul's decay manifesting on the flesh. The mask you wear today will be your shroud tomorrow, they warned. Isabeau watched her skin turn gray beneath the white paint and wondered if the friar was right. Was the lead poisoning her, or was God slowly withdrawing His light from her body as punishment for her vanity? The line between science and sin was non-existent. The wedding confessional. On the eve of her marriage, Isabeau was required to confess. She knelt in the dark, the scent of incense fighting the musk of her perfume. "Have you used the art of the devil to ensnare your husband?" the confessor whispered behind the screen. Isabeau lied. She claimed her paleness was from prayer, and her golden hair was a gift of nature. She knew the priest knew she was lying, yet the ritual had to be performed. This was the silhouette of deception. The church forced women into a position where their very existence was a lie. They had to be beautiful to be good, but they had to lie about their beauty to be pious. The final judgment of the altar. As Isabeau walked down the aisle, the bishop stood at the end, his eyes scanning her face for the cracks in the mask. He saw the white lead, he saw the belladonna darkened eyes, and he saw the cinnabar lips. In his blessing, there was a hidden curse. "May your soul be as clear as the face you present today," he intoned. It was a threat. He knew the face was a construction. He knew the lily was a chemical lie. To the church, the bride was a beautiful blasphemy, a monument of human vanity that stood in the house of God. The legacy of the divine war. For the modern world, the battle between religion and makeup has faded into a quiet whisper. But for Isabeau, it was a war for her eternity. The price of beauty was a soul weighed down by the guilt of the mirror. She stood as a duchess, radiant and perfect, but in her heart she carried the fear that she had traded her God for a jar of lead.
The Church's wrath ensured that a woman could never be just beautiful. She had to be a saint or a sinner, and in the Middle Ages, the more beautiful she appeared, the more likely she was to be the latter. A banquet of restraint. The medieval wedding feast was a spectacle of excess, a groaning table of roasted swans, spiced venison, and rivers of hypocras wine. But for Lady Isabeau, the feast was a desert. To be a bride of noble standing was to embody the ethereal ideal, a woman so spiritual, so detached from the sins of the flesh that she appeared to survive on prayer alone. This was a banquet of restraint, a silent, starving ritual where the bride was the only guest forbidden from the meal. The theology of the empty vessel. The pressure to starve began long before the wedding bells. In the 14th century, fat was the mark of the peasant, a sign of a body that was vulgar and too much in the world. A noblewoman, however, was expected to be a fasting saint. The clergy and the court poets praised the wasp-like waist and the hollowed cheek. They believed that a hungry body was a pious body, and that by denying the stomach, a bride was making room for the Holy Spirit. "Hunger is the polish of the soul," Isabeau's mother whispered as she removed a crust of bread from her daughter's hand. "If you eat like a commoner, you will look like a commoner, thick, heavy, and unremarkable." The mechanical hunger. The starvation was not just a choice, it was a physical necessity enforced by the corset of iron and bone. As we have seen, Isabeau's torso was so tightly bound that her stomach had no room to expand. To eat a full meal was to risk a violent, agonizing bursting of the laces, or worse, a public vomiting that would be seen as a sign of a weak and gluttonous nature. Isabeau's diet consisted of the cotton cleanse. She would swallow small balls of wool or cotton soaked in vinegar, which occupied the space in her stomach and suppressed the agonizing pangs of hunger. As the servants brought out the spiced meats, Isabeau's mouth watered with a primal, desperate need. But she sat motionless. She took only tiny, symbolic sips of watered wine and nibbled on a single, thin slice of pear. To the guests, she was a vision of purity. To Isabeau, she was a dying animal in a silk cage. The fasting saint phenomenon. The extreme starvation often led to a medical condition the medieval world called inedia, and what we now recognize as a form of anorexia nervosa. As the wedding neared, Isabeau's body began to consume itself. Her skin, already poisoned by lead, grew even more translucent as her fat stores vanished. Her eyes grew large and sunken, giving her that haunting, romantic gaze that the Duke so admired. "She is almost transparent," the guests whispered in awe. "She is closer to the angels than to the earth." But the angelic look came with a price. Isabeau suffered from constant dizziness, her hair became even more brittle, and her heartbeat was a faint, irregular drum. She was a fasting saint not by choice, but by the crushing weight of social expectation. She was starving herself to death to ensure her wedding portrait was perfect.
The hallucinations of the hungry. By the middle of the 6-hour banquet, the starvation began to play tricks on Isabeau's mind. Combined with the belladonna drops in her eyes, the hunger caused vivid, terrifying hallucinations. The tapestries on the walls seemed to move, the roasted meats seemed to scream, and the faces of the guests became distorted masks. She was in a trance of the starved. When she spoke her vows, she felt as though her voice was coming from a great distance. She was not a girl marrying a man. She was a ghost participating in a play. This was the ultimate restraint. She had to maintain the mask of the lily and the rose, while her internal organs were shutting down from lack of fuel. The secret collapse. When the banquet finally ended and the bride and groom were led to the chamber, Isabeau's body reached its breaking point. As soon as the heavy velvet robes were removed, the reawakening of her nerves began.
Without the support of the corset and the adrenaline of the ceremony, she collapsed in a dead faint. The Duke found her delicacy charming. He did not realize that his bride was suffering from acute malnutrition and a blood sugar crash so severe it could have killed her. To the medieval husband, a wife who ate nothing was a wife who cost nothing and demanded nothing. The legacy of the hollow bride. For the modern American listener, the wedding diet is a familiar concept. But Isabeau's hunger was not about fitting into a dress. It was about fitting into a theology of erasure. The banquet of restraint was the final test of her nobility. It proved that she had the iron will to deny her own biology for the sake of an image. Isabeau had paid the price with her flesh, literally hollowing herself out to become the ethereal icon her world demanded. She was a bride of air and bone, a woman who had learned that in the pursuit of beauty, the ultimate victory was to disappear entirely. The wedding chamber's secret. The cathedral bells had fallen silent. The echoes of the banquet had faded into the stone walls of the castle. Now the performance was over. Behind the heavy oak doors of the wedding chamber, the ethereal icon had to be dismantled. This was the wedding chamber's secret, the moment of profound psychological terror when the bride was forced to shed the layers of toxic paint and reveal the skin that had been sacrificed for the sake of the ceremony. For Lady Isabeau, this was not a moment of intimacy, it was a moment of exposure. The unpinning of the icon. The process of becoming human again was as mechanical as the preparation. Catherine worked in silence, her fingers trembling as she unpinned the 50-pound jeweled surcoat. As the heavy velvet hit the floor, Isabeau felt a violent surge of blood back into her limbs, the reawakening we discussed before. But the physical relief was quickly replaced by a cold, sharpened panic. Without the gold thread and the ermine fur, she felt small, fragile, and dangerously exposed. "The oil, Catherine," Isabeau whispered, her eyes fixed on the dark, polished mirror, "before the candles are lit any brighter." The dissolving of the lily. The removal of the makeup was a brutal ritual. The white lead ceruse had dried into a thick porcelain-like crust. To remove it, Catherine used a mixture of warm almond oil and harsh wine vinegar. As the oil touched her face, the lily began to melt. The white paint ran in ghostly streaks down Isabeau's neck, looking like tears of lead. But beneath the paint, the reality was devastating. The mercury lotions and the lead had done their work. Her natural skin was no longer the soft pink flesh of a 14-year-old girl. It was sallow, gray-toned, and covered in angry red chemical burns where the arsenic had bitten too deep. Isabeau stared at her reflection. Without the deadly gleam, she looked like a corpse that had been poorly preserved. The secret was out. The beauty was a shell, and the shell was hollow. The vulnerability of the natural face. In the American context, we speak of natural beauty as an ideal, but for the medieval bride, the natural face was a source of shame. Isabeau felt as though she were standing naked in a field of glass. Her eyebrows were gone, plucked to the bone, leaving her face looking alien and perpetually startled. Her hairline, moved back by fire and tweezers, looked raw and inflamed in the dim light. "Will he recognize me?" she asked, her voice cracking. She wasn't asking if he would know her name. She was asking if he would still value the commodity he had purchased. If the rose was just a stain of beetle blood, and the lily was just a layer of poison, then what was left for a husband to love? This was the psychological toll, the realization that her entire value was based on a lie that she had to reconstruct every single morning of her life. The removal of the beautiful death. As the night progressed, even her vision began to shift. The belladonna drops were slowly wearing off, and the watery gaze was replaced by the stinging reality of light sensitivity. Isabeau's pupils contracted painfully, and for the first time that day, she saw the room and the Duke with terrifying clarity. She saw the age in his face, the calculation in his eyes. She realized that he, too, was part of the performance. The secret of the chamber was that both participants were playing roles in a theater of status. The Mask of the Morning. The greatest fear of the medieval bride was not the wedding night itself, but the first morning. How could she wake up before him? How could she reapply the lead, the cinnabar, and the saffron before he saw the gray ghost beside him in the bed? Isabeau realized that her life would now be a perpetual race against the light. She would have to be a master of shadows, ensuring that her husband only ever saw the painted icon and never the sacrificed woman. The psychological burden of this deception was a weight heavier than any velvet gown. It was a life sentence of maintenance. The legacy of the hidden face. As the candles flickered out, Isabeau lay in the dark. The smell of musk still clung to her skin, but the gleam was gone. She was a woman of bone and bruised flesh, living in the wreckage of her own vanity. In the modern world, we speak of taking off our masks at the end of the day, but for Isabeau, there was no true self left to find. She had surrendered her skin to the lead, her hair to the sun, and her breath to the iron. The wedding chamber's secret was the ultimate tragedy of the medieval age, that in the search of divine beauty, the woman had been entirely erased, leaving only a scarred survivor in the dark. Scarred sovereignty. To read the history of Europe's great dynasties is to read a medical ledger of self-inflicted wounds. While we have followed the imagined journey of Lady Isabeau, her story is anchored in the very real suffering of queens, duchesses, and princesses. These women held the scepters of nations, yet they were powerless against the societal mandate of the perfect mask. This was scarred sovereignty, a testament that the higher the rank, the more lethal the beauty regimen became. The leaden mask of Elizabeth I of England. Perhaps the most famous victim of the deadly gleam was the Virgin Queen herself, Elizabeth I of England. Though she ruled into the Renaissance, her beauty standards were firmly rooted in the medieval obsession with the lily. After a bout of smallpox left her face scarred and pitted, Elizabeth turned to Venetian ceruse with a desperate fervor. Over decades, the lead did more than just whiten her skin. It corroded it. The lead reacted with her natural oils to create a permanent grayish-yellow tint, which she then covered with even thicker layers of paste, sometimes an inch thick. By the end of her reign, the mask of youth was a literal crust. The psychological toll was immense. Elizabeth banned mirrors from her presence in her final years, unable to look upon the gray ghost the lead had created. Her hair fell out in clumps, her memory faltered, a classic symptom of lead encephalopathy, and her skin became like parchment. She died a sovereign of a global empire, but a prisoner of a mineral poison.
The mercury madness of Maria of Portugal. Princess Maria of Portugal, upon her marriage into the Spanish Habsburg line, inherited a portly culture obsessed with the alabaster glow. To maintain her status, she utilized lotions heavily fortified with quicksilver, mercury, and arsenic. The historical accounts of Maria's later years describe a woman plagued by the tremors and sudden violent outbursts of rage. In the 16th century, these were dismissed as melancholia or the hysteria of the womb. Modern toxicology, however, points to acute mercury poisoning. The mercury did not just scar her face, it scarred her mind. It leached the calcium from her bones and the sanity from her thoughts.
Her sovereignty was a gilded cage where every application of her beauty wash brought her closer to a nervous collapse. She was a queen in title, but a victim of a chemical war she didn't even know she was fighting. The Austrian tragedy. In the courts of Central Europe, the obsession with paleness led to the ingestion of arsenic wafers. Noble women believed that eating small amounts of the poison would kill the red blood cells, providing a transparent, ethereal glow from the inside out. The result was a generation of women with arsenic skin. They suffered from hyperpigmentation, dark liver-colored spots that appeared on the neck and chest, which they then had to hide with even more lead-based powders. Their fingernails became brittle and developed white ridges, and many suffered from chronic organ failure before the age of 30. These were not delicate women by nature. They were women being systematically poisoned by the very standards they were forced to uphold. Their beauty was not sign of health, but a visual countdown to their demise. Sophia Magdalene of Denmark. The price of beauty often extended to the very teeth of the sovereign. Queen Sophia Magdalene of Denmark was so obsessed with pearl-white teeth that she used a highly acidic cleaning spirit provided by her alchemist. The acid did indeed whiten her teeth, but it also stripped away the enamel entirely. By her mid-30s, her teeth were black, rotted stumps. To maintain her sovereignty, she stopped speaking in public, communicating only through handwritten notes and subtle gestures to hide the hollow smile beneath her painted lips. Her life became a silent pantomime. The woman who could command armies could not dare to laugh for fear that the world would see the rot that beauty had caused. The conclusion of the mask. The stories of these queens reveal a haunting truth. The price of beauty was universal. From the lowest noble bride to the highest empress, the tools of the trade were the same: lead, mercury, arsenic, and fire. Scarred sovereignty is the final proof that medieval beauty was a form of ritualized violence. These women were icons, yes, but they were icons painted in blood and poison. As we look back at their portraits today, we must look past the gold thread and the lily skin. We must see the scars, the tremors, and the silence. They were the ultimate brides of the price, and their legacy is a warning that remains etched in the very stones of history. The price of aging. In the 14th century, there was no room for the matron. A woman's value was tethered to the maiden look, that fleeting, ethereal moment of youth before the trials of childbirth and the passage of time. For Lady Isabeau, now a mother of 3, the mirror had become an enemy that required a daily declaration of war. This was the price of aging, a desperate and often dangerous struggle to freeze time using chemicals that only accelerated the body's decay. The postpartum panic. In the medieval view, childbirth was a shattering of the female form. It brought the stretch, the sag, and the darkening of the humors. To the Duke and his peers, a wife who showed the physical marks of motherhood was a woman who had lost her divine glow. To fight this, Isabeau turned to the most aggressive firming tinctures of the era. She would wrap her torso in linen soaked in ice-cold vinegar and alum, a mineral that causes the skin to contract violently. Imagine the sensation, the stinging cold, the smell of acid, and the feeling of her skin being pulled tight until it nearly split. It provided a temporary plumping effect, but the alum was a desiccant. It sucked the moisture from her cells, ensuring that once the effect wore off, her skin would be even more wrinkled and brittle than before. She was trading her future skin for a few hours of maidenhood. The erasure of the crow's foot. As the years passed, the deadly gleam of white lead ceruse became a necessity rather than a luxury. But wrinkles presented a new problem. The lead pink would crack and settle into the lines around her eyes and mouth, highlighting the very age she sought to hide. The solution was a terrifying procedure known as the glazing. Catherine would prepare a mixture of egg whites, gum arabic, and a trace of white lead. This glaze was painted over Isabel's face in thin layers. As it dried, it created a smooth, glass-like surface that pulled the skin taut, effectively laminating her face. While she wore the glaze, Isabel could not smile, laugh, or even chew solid food. To do so would cause the glass to shatter, leaving her face covered in white flakes and deep artificial fissures. She became a silent, unmoving mask at her own dinner table. A woman who could command armies could not dare to laugh for fear that the world would see the rot that beauty had caused. The viper's oil. When the common herbs failed, the nobility reached for the exotic cures. One of the most expensive anti-aging treatments involved the fat of vipers. It was believed that because a snake sheds its skin to remain young, its oil would grant the same power to a woman. Isabeau would have this rancid, oily substance rubbed into her neck and décolletage every night. Often these oils were mixed with sublimated mercury to ensure the skin remained white. The combination was a biological disaster. The mercury continued to poison her nervous system, while the animal fats, often poorly preserved, caused the rot of the rose, a series of skin infections and pustules that she then had to cover with more lead. She was caught in a cycle of corrosion. Every attempt to look younger damaged her skin, necessitating more chemicals, which, in turn, aged her even faster. The desperation of the hair. It was not just the skin that betrayed her. The saffron glow we discussed in earlier chapters had left Isabel's hair thin and gray by the age of 25. To maintain the angelic look, she was forced to wear elaborate hairpieces made of silk thread and the hair of peasant girls, women who sold their virgin tresses for a few loaves of bread. These heavy wigs, often called crespins, were pinned into her remaining hair with sharp iron bodkins. The weight caused traction alopecia, permanent baldness caused by the constant pulling of the scalp. Isabel was becoming a ghost of the wardrobe, a woman who was mostly made of silk, lead, and borrowed hair. The psychological toll. The price was most heavy in the mind. Isabel lived in a state of chronophobia, the fear of time. Every morning was a battle against the sun. She refused to walk in the gardens during midday, for the harsh light would reveal the cracks in the glaze. She became a creature of the candlelight and the shadows. This withdrawal from the world was often seen as pious seclusion, but it was actually a desperate attempt to maintain her commodity value. She knew that if the Duke saw her as aged, her influence at court would vanish. Her beauty was her only political currency, and it was a currency that was rapidly devaluing. The final reflection. By the time Isabel reached her 30th year, she looked 50. Her skin was a grayish, scarred landscape. Her teeth were loose from mercury, and her spirit was exhausted by the constant labor of maintenance. She had paid the price of aging with her very life force. In her attempt to remain a maiden, she had forgotten how to be a woman. In her attempt to remain a maiden, she had forgotten how to be a woman. She was a bride who refused to grow, and in doing so, she became a monument to a beauty that was as cold and as lifeless as the stone. The apothecary's ledger. Behind every pale face and every crimson lip, there was a clink of gold in a heavy iron box. While the brides bled and the queens withered, a different class of men grew fat on the spoils of vanity. This was the apothecary's ledger, a look into the dark commercial heart of the Middle Ages. In the narrow, soot-stained alleys of the merchant districts, beauty was not an ideal, it was a product, a substance to be weighed, measured, and sold at the highest.
The price of the poison. The profit margins in the beauty trade were astronomical. A jar of ceruse, which cost the apothecary only a few copper coins in raw lead and vinegar, was sold to the nobility for silver florins. The ledger told the story of a cold-blooded economy. Item: 1 ounce of cinnabar, mercury ore. Cost to the apothecary 2 shillings. Sale price to the duchess 20 shillings. Why such a markup? Because the apothecary sold more than just powder. He sold the secret of the court. He knew that if the duke's daughter looked common at her wedding, the family's political alliances might fail. He was not just selling makeup, he was selling the success of a dynasty. The adulteration of the cure. The greed did not stop at high prices, it extended to the quality of the goods. To increase their profits, many apothecaries cut their expensive pigments with cheaper, even more toxic substances. They would mix the expensive Kermes beetle dust with red lead, a cheaper, heavier pigment that poisoned the lips faster. They would stretch the saffron hair dyes with yellow sulfur, which caused more severe chemical burns to the scalp. Isabeau, sitting in her castle, believed she was using the finest ingredients money could buy. In reality, she was often paying a premium for the apothecary's trash. The ledger did not record the ingredients, it only recorded the profit. For Master Thomas, a bride's death was a tragedy, but a bride's long-term addiction to his creams was a triumph. The Merchants of Hope. The apothecary was a master of psychological warfare. When Isabeau began to flake from the lead, Thomas did not tell her to stop. Instead, he introduced her to a new discovery, a lotion made of pearl dust and quicksilver. "This will seal the skin, my lady," he would say with a bow, "and return the light to your eyes." He was creating the very problems he then fixed with even more expensive poisons. The ledger grew thicker, the apothecary's house grew larger, and Isabeau's health grew thinner. It was a parasitic relationship where the merchant fed on the bride's desperation until there was nothing left but a hollowed-out icon and an empty treasury. The silent collusion. The apothecary did not work alone. He was part of a global trade network. The silk merchants, the spice traders, and the goldsmiths all benefited from the bride's transformation. The heavier the dress, the more profit for the weaver. The more perfume required to hide the lack of bathing, the more wealth for the traders from the East. The price they paid for beauty was the fuel that ran the medieval economy. The bride was the engine of consumption, and everyone, from the priest to the merchant, was there to take their cut. The legacy of the ledger. As we look at the modern beauty industry, a multi-billion-dollar machine, we see the shadow of Master Thomas's ledger. We still pay premiums for secret formulas and age-defying serums. Isabeau was the first consumer of a dream that was designed to be unattainable. The apothecary knew that if she ever felt perfect, she would stop buying. Therefore, the beauty standard had to be impossible. The ledger was a record of a war that the bride could never win. The final tally. When Master Thomas closed his book for the final time, it contained the names of 100 dead brides. To him, they were just ink on a page, numbers that added up to a life of luxury for himself. Isabeau was a victim of lead, yes, but she was also a victim of the marketplace. She had paid for her own destruction, coin by coin, believing that she was buying a future when she was actually buying a shroud. The apothecary's ledger remains a haunting reminder that where there is vanity, there is a merchant waiting to turn it into gold. The legacy of the veil. The heavy oak doors of history have a way of shutting shut, but the echoes of what happened behind them remain. We began in this journey in the cold stone chambers of Burgundy, following Lady Isabeau as she sacrificed her skin to the lead and her breath to the iron. Now we reach the final reflection, the legacy of the veil.
It is a legacy that did not die with the Middle Ages, but rather it evolved, paving the way for the multi-billion-dollar beauty empires of the 21st century and proving that the price of the perfect look is a debt that humanity is still paying. The evolution of the mask. To the modern American listener, the idea of rubbing lead on one's face sounds like a primitive madness, yet the psychology remains unchanged. The medieval lily and the rose has merely become the filter and the filler. We no longer use Venetian ceruse, but we use chemical peels that burn the skin to reveal a youthful glow. We no longer use belladonna to dilate our pupils, but we use digital algorithms to enlarge our eyes in photographs. The price has shifted from the apothecary's jar to the surgeon's scalpel and the smartphone screen. Isabeau's struggle was a physical one. Ours is often digital, yet both lead to the same destination, the erasure of the natural self in favor of a social ideal. The veil has not been removed, it has simply become invisible. The enduring architecture of the body. The corset of iron and bone did not vanish, it transformed into the waist trainer and the restrictive diet culture. The medieval belief that a woman's body must be reshaped to be virtuous remains a haunting undercurrent in our modern world. When we look at the history of Isabeau's bruised ribs and fainting spells, we are looking at the grandmother of modern body dysmorphia. The Middle Ages taught us that a woman's value is a geometric calculation, the width of the waist, the height of the forehead, the paleness of the skin. We are still living in the architecture of that 14th century dream, where the body is a piece of clay to be molded by the hands of society. The commercialized insecurity. The apothecary's ledger was the blueprint for the modern beauty industry. Master Thomas knew a secret that modern corporations have mastered, that a cure is only profitable if the disease of aging is seen as a moral failure. We are still sold the Saffron Glow under different names. We are told that our natural hair is a problem to be solved, that our natural scent is a filth to be masked by expensive musks. The commercialization of desperation is the enduring legacy of the medieval bride. The price she paid in gold was the first down payment on an industry that thrives on the idea that a woman is never enough as she is. The ghost of Isabeau. What happened to Lady Isabeau? History does not record the names of every bride who withered under the lead, but we can imagine her final days, sitting in the shadows of a castle she helped build with her dowry, her skin ashen, her hair thin, her spirit exhausted. She was a sovereign of scars. She had achieved the perfect look, and it had cost her the very vitality she needed to enjoy her life. Her story is a warning whispered through the centuries. It tells us that when we sacrifice our health for an image, we are not becoming more than human, we are becoming less. The breaking of the mirror. The legacy of the veil asks us a final, difficult question. When will we stop paying the price? For Isabeau, there was no escape. She was a prisoner of her era, her religion, and her class. But for us, the mirror can be broken. We can choose to see the rose and the lily, not as chemical targets, but as natural variations of a living, breathing body. We can honor the memory of the medieval brides, those who bled, those who starved, and those who were poisoned by refusing to follow them on to the altar of aesthetics. The final word. The story of the medieval bride is a tragedy in 20 parts. It is a chronicle of pain, poison, and profit. But as the final candle flickers out on this narrative, let us remember that the most divine beauty Isabeau ever possessed was the one she was born with, the face before the lead, the hair before the saffron, the breath before the iron. The veil is finally lifted, the price has been calculated, and the cost was far too high.